Hello, and welcome to another interview with Muview with Mo. Again, I am your host, Morrison Nolan, and today I will be introducing you to my friend and recently minted PhD, Dr. Christopher Griffin.
That's me. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to hear what questions you have.
Yeah, glad you could join us. So to start things off, why don't you talk a little bit about your research? If I could summarize your interests briefly, you are a paleontologist and evolutionary biologist looking at broad changes in the bodies of vertebrate animals over geological time.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. I'm really interested in the evolution of form and the origin of major groups of animals. And vertebrates are a really good way to study that because we have a fairly good fossil record of vertebrates, and they have lots of anatomy, right? There's lots of shape on vertebrate bones, so you can really get at a lot of the nitty gritty of how animal anatomy has evolved through time and how that influences the origins of the major groups of animals that we see today.
Yeah. Without getting too specific, but a lot of your research has dealt with the evolution of the early body plans of dinosaurs and some of their relatives. And you've done some very interesting things and have found some very interesting material. Would you like to talk about the projects you've worked on as a master and PhD student here at Virginia Tech?
Yeah, sure. So I've been interested in a lot of what might I think at first look like very different or disparate projects, but they're all kind of united to me because it's all about these same questions that I'm interested in, right? Which is evolution of anatomy and origin of major groups, and especially I'm interested in how growth and development can influence vertebrate evolution. And so one of the things I've been really interested in is studying the origin and early evolution of dinosaurs, because when dinosaurs first evolved, when they first started out, I like to think about them as like the small kids on the playground, right? There's lots of bigger, badder, more widespread, more speciose, more abundant groups at the
Big
time.
crocodiles, big phytosaurs, big aidosaurs.
Right. There's lots of these big reptiles. Dinosaurs are you wouldn't, looking at the landscape back then, if you had a time machine and also didn't know what dinosaurs would become, you probably wouldn't pick them out of the flock, as it were, to say like, oh, this is, here's the future right here. And early dinosaurs actually don't look very different from lots of other reptile groups at the time. So it's been a long-standing question about what set dinosaurs apart, what made dinosaurs eventually rise to the success that they experienced, where they take over the world, they're abundant, they're extremely widespread, they're living in all these different ecologies, they have a very wide range of body sizes. How did that happen? How did that transition occur? What was controlling it? Why did other things go extinct and dinosaurs not? So these are long-running questions that I've kind of been plopped right into the middle of, and so that's kind of, I would say, one of the main fronts of my research program.
Nice.
And then the other front, which I got into about halfway through my PhD, so I don't have as much training in this, but it's something that's very quickly become a foremost part of my interest and something I'll be continuing to pursue as a postdoc, is the influence of developmental patterns on evolution. So the things that you can see that happen in embryos as embryos develop, and how that relates to the evolutionary stories that we see in the rock record. And for this, I'm mainly interested in the origin of the bird body plan and the origin of birds, which did come from dinosaurs. So I like to think of it as kind of dinosaurs. People often think of the rise and fall of dinosaurs, but I like to think about it as there's two rises. The first is about 200 million years ago, when dinosaurs first came from, being the small kids on the playground to ruling the playground. And then the second rise was the origin of birds. And now birds are the most abundant land vertebrates today.
Yeah.
And there's no other dinosaurs left. So we're still living in the age of dinosaurs.
Yeah, we often call this the age of the mammals, but certainly birds are far more abundant and speciose than any of us little furry guys are.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of returning to your first area of research, it's interesting to think about how you point out how dinosaurs start out very unassuming and relatively minor parts of their environments, and then come to prominence after an extinction event wipes out a lot of their macrofaunal competition. We're going through a macrofaunal extinction right now. You wonder what unassuming groups currently are going to, which particular brand of neek will inherit the earth we're creating.
It's true. I mean, I hope it's humans, but
I'm betting on some sort of giant rats and other rodents. They seem pretty well placed for all this.
Rats. Well, yeah. What's everybody say now? Like future paleontologists will say this is the age of the cow, or something like that. Cows and rats
Anthony Martin had a very interesting point about, people talk about indicators of the Anthropocene, that future paleontologists will certainly use one particular galliform bird as as an indicator of the Anthropocene, which led me to realize that, in certain North American deposits, not only will you have that indicator, but you will have a yearly resolution cyclicity indicator of isolated abundance of a closely related, though much larger galliform.
That's true. Yeah.
I'm just imagining some distant alien paleontologist publishing that paper on seasonal cyclicity.
Yeah.
In Anthropocene waste deposit burial sites. Yeah. Well, thank you for the summary of your research. In this part now, I'd like to learn a little bit more about your background, kind of where you grew up, what fostered your interest in science in general, and what ultimately led you into these fields of paleontology.
Yeah, I lived in quite a few places growing up. I moved a lot, but I spent most of my childhood in the south side of Atlanta. I've lived in Texas, I've lived in California, Ohio, Indiana, now Virginia. And I have family that's very widely flung as well. So I've lived a lot of places. So that's kind of my basic background. I've never not been interested in paleontology. I've always been just really fascinated with animals and biology in general, but also the history of it and the history of our planet. And when I was in college, I majored in both biology and geology because I had that interest in both things. And I knew I would need to do research in order to, have some research experience at least in order to be competitive to get into graduate school somewhere. And I was hoping that I could study paleontology, but if I was going to study something else too, like that would have been okay, because I hadn't really done any paleontology work yet. So I didn't necessarily know how much I would like it. I just knew that I was interested in it. Mm-hmm. And so the summer before my last year of college, I got an REU, so a research experience for undergraduates internship through the National Science Foundation at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, which is a wonderful museum. It's absolutely enormous. There's millions of specimens. And I was just ecstatic. I was over the moon because I would get to spend the whole summer doing a paid internship on paleontology research on a project that was basically my own. And this was really important because I had tried to find other research experiences throughout college, but I needed to make money so that, I could pay rent and eat and all that stuff. And there weren't a whole lot of paid research opportunities for undergraduates in paleontology.
You don't say.
So, yeah. So I would, end up working as a landscaper or on a paint crew or, something like that. And so I was very excited to get this opportunity. And I worked some with a curator but I was mostly working with a postdoctoral researcher who was at the Field Museum at the time, Sterling Nesbitt, who would, about 6 months after, start a job as a assistant professor at Virginia Tech. And so we continued to work remotely on my project, me writing the manuscript mostly, because all the data was collected that summer. And then after I graduated, I followed to become one of his first graduate students. So I did my master's at Virginia Tech, and then I stayed for my PhD. And Sterling and I had and continue to have a really great working relationship. I love working with him. I assume that he likes working with me because it's
Keeps
been
you
like
around.
7 or 8 years. um,
You know, at
and so
UGA,
that, but,
at UGA, when you get 2 degrees, they call you a double dog. I wonder what they call you here at Virginia Tech when you get 2 degrees.
I don't know, a double hokey maybe.
Yeah. Uh, hopefully they have something clever.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I've never heard a term for it. But yeah, so I was able to stay here for my PhD, and that was really great because I could just had a lot of ideas, and this was a great place to pursue them. And I
Got in
just
on
hit
the
the
ground floor, and now
Yep.
you're certainly, in a penthouse suite, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, still making grad school wages, so
That's true. That's true. But you are
yeah.
going to do a postdoc at Yale.
Yes, I will. So yeah, I was just gonna say that during my time at Virginia Tech, I was awarded more generous NSF funding in the form of a graduate research fellowship, which gave me the freedom to spend a semester working at a different lab in Yale that does a lot of developmental biology stuff because the way my questions were kind of evolving, no pun intended, I started to get interested in developmental processes and how these might influence evolution. So somewhat going beyond the fossil record, but also taking what you learn from embryos and applying it to my knowledge of the fossil record. And so I was able to learn a lot, learn tons about developmental biology during that time, and it formed a part of my that project formed a part of my dissertation. And then uh, I'll be able to continue that connection in the near future. We'll see with COVID-19 and everything when I actually move up there. But my official start date as of now is July 1st. And I'll go up there and continue to be looking at developmental processes and how it influences the evolution of mostly reptile anatomy.
Nice, nice. So earlier you talked a little bit about your enthusiasm for the Field Museum, and I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking about the Field Museum and other natural history museums that you have worked with and enjoyed. I'll say personally, I've had the chance to visit the Field Museum twice, and I've enjoyed both visits. One of my favorite exhibits is that they have an early 1900s automobile that was in a garage that was hit by a small meteorite. And while they don't have
Yes.
any parts of the garage, they still have the car with a hole in the seat where the meteorite hit the seat.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of my favorite things that they have out on display.
Oh yeah, they've got, I mean, it's the Field Museum. It's one of the largest museums in the country, if not the world. So they have just amazing exhibits. But something that I'm constantly reminding people, because I travel, most of my data come from museums. I travel to museums all over the country, all over the world. I don't know how many museums I visit in a year, but um, I would say the average is probably between like 3 to 5, maybe. But people, I'll tell my roommates or friends, oh, I'm going to Brazil to look to a museum. And that sounds very strange to them because people think museums, they think exhibits.
Mhm.
And that's true. That's an important part of what a museum does is the education and the outrage. But a museum is really about the collections, and you're seeing normally about 1% of the actual collections that the museum holds on display. Most of what the museum has is kind of under the water. It's the iceberg analogy, right?
Yeah.
So, and even if a museum didn't have exhibits at all, it would still be able to contribute to its goal or mission statement, which is to preserve scientific objects for research and study, and for education and outreach. So what you're seeing in exhibits is kind of it's kind of like a taste or kind of a best of the museum's collections, or what the museum uh, design, the people behind the museum design think would be particularly interesting or particularly enlightening for the public. But I've been to museums a lot where I've never even gone to the exhibits. I was just like really quick
Yeah.
trip. I was only there a day. I didn't have time. I was just there the entire time the museum was open. I was there down in normally the basement, collecting data from all the fossils that are down there. And there's some real gems. So
In those
I
nice
museums are,
climate-controlled rooms.
yeah. So museums are probably the most important part of my work as far as a source of data. And they also, you build on museum collections, so to pursue new projects. So how many times, I don't know how many times I've been puttering around just looking at different bones or different fossils in a museum and gotten an idea for a new project. The museum in Zimbabwe that I went to collect data during my master's, I met lots of great people. They were really interested in promoting paleontological research in Zimbabwe, and I started being interested in doing some field work with them in Zimbabwe, and that turned into some really exciting finds. I've now spent more time in Zimbabwe than I have any other country besides the US. So
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about your work in Zimbabwe. Listening to your defense and some of the other talks you've given about your experience, it sounds like you have a really great example of kind of a classic paleontological question and a classic paleontological story where someone is looking at the fossil record and at paleo distributions and thinks we should see these sorts of animals in this place based on the distribution of known fossils in paleocontinents. We know that there's some to the continents to the right and some to the left, so why don't we find them there? And you realized this about some early dinosaurs and started looking for them in Zimbabwe.
yeah, so the kind of one half of the story is I was studying early dinosaur growth for my master's project, and the museum in Zimbabwe, the Natural History Museum, is relatively small, but it's actually a really nice museum. Uh, I think it's one of the largest, second largest or largest in Southern Africa. They actually have I think it's tied for the largest mounted elephant in
Oh,
the world. They're tied with the Smithsonian. Um, so anyway, I was there. I was interested in all the stuff, and it just seemed like nobody had done too much paleontological fieldwork in Zimbabwe for several decades. And so I was really interested in early dinosaurs. And as I was poking around in the literature in Zimbabwe, I found references to this one formation that was Carney in age. So it's about 230 million years old. And they know that because of this weird reptile. They found a few little fragments of a fossil, and that reptile is only known from deposits of those age. So you know how old the rock is.
mhm.
And I had also been thinking a lot at the time about the world of the earliest dinosaurs, where they originated and when they first evolved. And that world was very different than ours. All the continents were arranged into one supercontinent called Pangaea. And we had just had a talk at Virginia Tech by a researcher whose group was part of a group that was part of a larger group that had hypothesized that there were very, very strong horizontal or latitudinal climate bands across Pangaea. So instead of the world we have today, where latitude does play a role in climate, right? You go further north, it gets colder. There's a lot of times there's deserts at 30 degrees latitude. That's where the Sahara is. That's where the Western US deserts are. But of course, that's not entirely true, right? Because otherwise Virginia, where we are now, would be a high desert.
Yeah.
And the reason latitude isn't such a big deal now is because all the continents are broken up. We have a lot more shoreline. There's lots of ocean currents that are all contributing to make a more complex climate.
We have
But
a polar current.
right, but at the time of Pangea, you've got enormous landmass with relatively very small amount of ocean influence. And so the latitudinal influence on climate is much, much stronger. And the very earliest dinosaurs from this time, the Carnian period, about 230 million years ago, they're very rare and they're only found in 3 places, which is northern Argentina, southern Brazil, and then there's a few bits and pieces from central India. And if you look at a map of Pangea and you overlay these climate bands on it, what you'll see is that this climate band draws basically a straight line between these 3 different localities, and that line also passes through, in the middle, southern Africa, in particular Zimbabwe. So I thought, well, if we've got rocks that we know are from the right age, and they look like they're from the right place, if dinosaurs are following this climate band, which I was thinking, then if there's enough fossils, then we should find some dinosaurs there. And so that was my pitch to National Geographic for an early career grant, which is a smaller grant that they do for graduate students and postdocs, but I think it's mostly graduate students. And set out in collaboration with the Zimbabwe Museum of Natural History. They were all on board and ready to really chomping at the bit to get out there, and spent about 2 weeks in the field. And some of the localities didn't turn up with anything, and some places we found just hundreds and hundreds of bones, including a nearly complete skeleton of a dinosaur that's a new species, about 230 million years old. So that makes it the oldest dinosaur found in Africa and equivalent in age to the oldest dinosaurs found anywhere in the world. So we've kind of added a fourth dot on the Pangea map for early dinosaurs, and sure enough, it's all right in that climate band.
It's very interesting stuff. Would you like to talk a little bit more about some of your collaborators that you've worked with, both here in the US and in Zimbabwe, and some of the research that they do?
That's a broad question.
Yeah.
I have quite a few collaborators. My main collaborator up to this point has obviously been my PhD advisor, Sterling Nesbitt. The workers in Zimbabwe are also mostly interested in the projects that they do that I'm not involved with, are still mostly involved with reptiles, just because the Zimbabwean rocks, the fossils are generally between Permian age to Jurassic age. So you get a lot of reptiles and then a lot of mammal relatives, what used to be called mammal-like reptiles. So that's where most of their research comes from, is lots of figuring out stratigraphy, trying to find fossils and correlating them to some better known deposits in South Africa. So that's a lot of their work. Michelle Stocker has been another collaborator of mine when I've done lots of Triassic stuff and phytosaurs. So I'm really part of like a kind of a broader North American group that studies generally what the world of the Triassic was like. So what the world of the earliest dinosaurs was like, what animals lived there, what the environments were like, and how it changed with extinction. It was a time of extreme turnover and ecological instability and probably some climate extremes. So really nailing down the story of the Triassic, I would say, is the biggest part of something that I and a lot of my collaborators are all interested in.
I think that always is kind of one of the biggest draws of paleontology, is that the world as it existed in the distant geological past is certainly a very alien place compared to now. I mean, think about how much warmer throughout most of the Mesozoic the Earth was than it is now, and just how radically different the assemblage of animals and plants were.
Hmm. Even the ecosystems seem to be very strange, and some of that might be the way the fossils are preserved or the fossils that we have. But
You mean in terms of like predator prey abundances, or what do you mean by?
yeah, yeah, a lot of the deposits from this time in the Triassic in the Western US seem to be very, very heavily skewed, both in the number of species and the absolute number of individuals towards predators. It seems like it's a predator dominated ecosystem. And I'm not sure, I don't know if anybody's really sure if that's a real signal or if there's some kind of bias in the rocks where predators are getting more easily preserved for some reason. But it's certainly interesting because for the most part, you think about ecosystems as being like a triangle or a kind of a pyramid scheme, right? Where the plants are making a lot of energy and then the herbivores eat that, but there's fewer herbivores because you can't have more energy going up the chain, right? Like
Can't get
some
something.
energy gets lost. And then there's normally even fewer carnivores because they primarily eat the herbivores and each other. So it's very strange. There's lots of weird things going on. Evolutionarily, the Triassic is a very weird time. It seems like you have a lot of the same body plans and features evolving independently of each other, just over and over and over again. So you might have um, a dinosaur-like animal that evolves, but it's very clearly a crocodile relative if you know what you're looking at with the anatomy. But if you ran into it in a dark alley, it's running around on two legs. It's got a little beak. It has its legs tucked up under its body. It looks, for all intents and purposes, like a dinosaur, and ecologically, it probably acted like a dinosaur. So
Kind
why?
kind
Hmm?
of also on that note, it seems like crocodile morphology was also a highly convergent form during the.
Oh yes, yeah,
A lot of
yep.
groups arrived at that same kind of large, semi-aquatic, snaggle-tooth, long snout shape.
Right. And even crocodiles today, a lot of times we think about them as sort of a living fossil, right? But crocodiles actually look very different from their ancestors.
Yeah,
So
we
they
do
kind
have
of re-evolved an ancestral sort of lifestyle. So it's very, yeah, it's very strange. There's lots of convergences with metabolism, with body plans, with ecological role. There's just a it's a very confusing topic to try to sort out all of these different things. What is similar because of common ancestry and what is similar because of convergence. It seems to be rampant during the Triassic. So
This next question is going to be development focused, and it might be a little bit misguided based on my own poor recollections of the subject. But one thing that I have heard is that, for example, of an unusual developmental constraint in modern marsupials, the morphology of the hands and feet is highly conserved between disseparate marsupial groups because of their short gestations. Their extremities must develop early in order to permit them to crawl up to their pouches. If I'm remembering that correctly, can you think of any other interesting kind of reptilian constraints that we see during embryological development that cause these sorts of similar, highly conserved morphologies in seemingly disparate reptile groups?
yeah, well, you've got the basic story there. Yeah, so marsupials, when they're born, they have to crawl into the pouch as basically a fetus, and
A little
so
jelly
they
bean, as I've heard it referred to.
mhm, yeah, it does. It looks like a little kind of creepy little jelly bean that you definitely wouldn't want to eat. But it's got big arms and just about nothing else because it has to use those arms to crawl. So at least the early evolution of a marsupial arm has only one function that it's constrained to. And because we as vertebrates don't really go through mortem, not well, we as amniotes, so reptiles um, and mammals don't really go through metamorphosis or anything like that. You're kind of stuck with the
The body plan you start off with.
body plan you start off with. And so, yeah, so it seems that marsupial limbs are more constrained. That's, as far as I know, the most recent literature. But it's interesting because, I mean, there are definitely constraints throughout development for everything, right? But reptiles as a whole seem to be far less constrained than mammals. So another very famous example of mammalian constraint is that all mammals, from a whale with almost, no neck, it's so short, to a giraffe, we all have exactly 7 vertebrae. There are two exceptions, sloths and manatees, which is really weird. Like, why those? But
Yeah, they're not at all particularly closely related.
right, but everything else, and so there's lots of ideas about why this constraint might be there, but one likely hypothesis, or something probably contributing to it, is a developmental constraint, because mammals are very unique in that we have a diaphragm to help our breathing. Most other groups, well, no other groups have a true diaphragm. Some groups have other structures that kind of act like a diaphragm, but that diaphragm in development, it comes from a between the primordial neck vertebrae
Hmm.
and kind of migrates down that tissue. And
Oh,
so
so
if you
weird.
mess up the idea is that if you mess up the count, the neck vertebrae count, then you mess up the development of the diaphragm, and then
Have a mammal who
you
can't
can't
breathe.
breathe and you die. Yeah, and so that's one reason. There's some other ideas related to there's certain mutation, like if a mutation occurs, it might make cancer more likely. So that's one reason. But mammals on the whole are much more constrained in their body plans relative to reptiles. Reptiles, if you think about all reptiles, they're extremely diverse. Some of them, especially in the fossil record, have very long necks, long tails, short tails. They might have 2 legs, 4 legs, no legs. They might give live birth or partially live birth or lay eggs. They have feathers, they have scales. Quite a few of them fly, so it's reptiles as a whole. Nothing nothing right now is jumping out to me as kind of a classic example of developmental constraint in reptiles. There are definitely developmental constraints. Like there have to be, um, there always are. But I can't think of any kind of like classic morphological ecological stories like you get with mammals. It's normally mammal have the more easy stories for developmental constraint.
Cool, cool. To kind of backtrack a little bit about museums, are there any museum collections that you would like to work with but have not yet had the chance to explore and analyze?
Yeah, for sure. The first thing that jumps out to my mind is the collections in Argentina, because of you see a lot of the same animals, not just early dinosaurs, but in Brazil, in Zimbabwe, and what's been reported in India, which I've also not been to. You see a whole lot of the same animal assemblages as the animals that we're finding in Zimbabwe. So that's why I went to Brazil almost exactly a year ago, a little over a year ago.
I was
And
going to try to go to Brazil this summer, but sadly that didn't work out.
yeah, no field work this summer, unfortunately.
There are some
Uh,
very important ediacaran localities in Brazil, and
oh yeah,
yeah, that I had hoped to visit and see some of the tubular fossils from as part of a conference and field trip, and sadly that didn't work out.
yeah, yeah. Well, I'm very grateful that I got to go last year and not this year. But it was actually it's a little bit surreal to go all the way. You dig up a bunch of bones from Zimbabwe, you go back to the States, you go all the way to Brazil, and you look at a museum collection, and sitting on the shelf is all the stuff that you just dug up in Zimbabwe. It's like it's a very very similar animal assemblage, but there's also this kind of similarly aged animals from northern Argentina that are there. And I would really like to get there to be able to make some compare and contrast the stuff that we've been finding in Zimbabwe and what I've been seeing in Brazil. They've got a really good collection there. There's lots of great scientists that are doing just like really productive work down in Argentina. I just, a combination of lack of time and lack of resources has meant that I haven't been able to get there yet. But
Well,
I'm
you're
planning to in the
still
next
young.
year.
The paleontological field, I'd say, is still your oyster, and there's plenty of time for you to get to work with those collections and make
Oh yeah, for
more and
sure.
more compelling discoveries.
Yep. So that's been the most. I mean, I've had Argentina. I've been wanting to go there since 2017 when I first started doing field work in Zimbabwe. So that's definitely top of my list right now for a museum whose depths I have not plumbed yet.
Well, Dr. Griffin, thank you again for your time, and I'm glad you could sit down and join us. One thing I like to ask my interviewees about is kind of the popular perception of their fields, and paleontology is often something that captures the public imagination. And do you have any particular thoughts about the ways that you appreciate how that works, and ways that you wish you could connect differently with the public through paleontology?
That's a good question. Um, hmm. Well, I think one of the big things is that it's very nice to have sort of an immediate, interesting inroad, right, to communicating my ideas or what I'm working on, because you can just say, "Oh, dinosaurs," or "Oh, birds," or whatever, and people are kind of immediately, even if they're not necessarily immediately interested, they have a conception. They have some kind of frame of reference. Oftentimes, that frame of reference is maybe uninformed, not because of like any particular fault of anyone. It's just not everybody can learn about everything, and it's a fairly obscure field, but
Mhm.
with a lot of pop culture, right? So people, most of their frame of reference comes from pop culture and not science, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Um, I think one thing is that I think often it often goes unappreciated, the incredible diversity and disparity of past life,
Mhm.
because I've found people have a frame of reference in their head where maybe there's like
The
fish or
dinosaurs, the ice
there's like a
now.
fish. Yeah, there's like a fish that crawled out of the water, and then there's dinosaurs, and then there's a woolly mammoth and cavemen and people, and they're all about evenly spaced out.
Lasting for the same periods of time.
Right. And so, like, I'm not saying that's necessarily, people are ignorant or wrong
Mhm.
for thinking that, but I think that it's often in the wider culture, like people miss out. I think that there are so many more interesting animals than just what we're exposed to in pop culture. Um, it would be like if the only animals they knew of today were cows, chickens, and dogs. Like,
Mhm.
it's fine to only know those three animals. There's nothing like morally wrong with that, but you're missing out on elephants and zebras and crocodiles and all the crazy birds and weird frogs, and like there's just so much more diversity. And so if somebody, like, I don't know, was raised in some weird environment where they only saw three animals and they liked those three animals, they just didn't know any other animals existed, like, you would kind of feel bad for them. You would just like, "Oh yeah, come here, let's go to a zoo or something," right?
As a
And so
student of the Ediacaran and early to middle Cambrian, I can certainly agree with and sympathize the desire to share the weird and wondrous diversity of past life.
oh yeah, so yeah, I think that's maybe one of the biggest things about the subject, is that I think that a lot of times people miss out on what truly strange and interesting and weird animals there have been in the past, and how many different periods of animal life there were. It's not just like a bunch of dinosaurs and a bunch of mammals. Like, uh, Tyrannosaurus Rex is closer to us than it is to the first dinosaurs that I work on.
Yeah.
This is a huge range of time, with lots of just really, really interesting animals and climate changing events and extinctions and originations. And yeah, it's just like it's like a big story. It's like if the only thing somebody knows about Star Wars is that Darth Vader is Luke's father. Like, yeah, that's fine if you pick it up from pop culture, but
It's important. It's an important part of the story, but it's
it's
not the whole thing.
yeah, they're like, you can get a lot more enjoyment by watching the whole movie.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for your time. I'm glad you could join us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Chris, how many pails would a paleocaster cast if a paleocaster could cast pails?
He would cast as many pails as a paleocaster wailed. If a paleocaster could cast pails.